Man, let me see your ID.
What's the reason you need it?
ID, now.
What do you need?
Where are you coming from? What are you doing in this park? You got anything on you?
I'm not answering personal questions without a reason on record. What crime are you investigating?
Just cooperating. This is over.
Cooperate with...
A patrol officer thought he could walk up to a black man in a crowded city park, order him off a bench, demand identification, and hold him there with no reason on record. What he did not know was that the calm man sitting with his hands visible was not just another lunch hour visitor. He was someone trained to stay controlled under pressure, and someone whose work required him to understand exactly how far a badge could legally go. At this moment, we want to tell you that we are incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now tell us where you're watching from, your city or state, in the comments. And if you like stories where people stay calm, hold their ground, and let the facts do the damage, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. This happened during a busy lunch hour at Harborview Park, the kind of public space where office workers ate at food trucks, runners cut through on paved paths, and tourists stopped for pictures near the water. The crowd was the point. It meant eyes, phones, body cams, and witnesses who did not owe anyone loyalty. The man on the bench was Michael Reynolds. He looked like a regular guy taking a break. Casual clothes, nothing that stood out, no loud movements, no confrontation. What nobody in the park could see was that Reynolds was operating undercover on an active FBI assignment, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His presence was lawful and intentional. The officer who approached him was Daniel Hart. Hart had the posture of someone used to instant compliance. He did not walk up like he was checking on a lost kid or responding to a call. He walked up like he had already decided how this interaction was going to end. Hart stopped directly in Reynolds' space and ordered him to stand up and produce identification. He did not explain why. He did not reference a complaint. He did not mention a dispatch call. He gave commands. Reynolds did not match the energy. He stayed seated. He kept both hands visible where anyone could see them. He did not argue about feelings or accuse Hart of anything in that moment. He did what trained people do when they want a clean record. He asked for the legal basis of the stop. Hart gave none. Instead, Hart repeated the demands for identification, like volume could replace justification. He added personal questions next, trying to pull information without stating a reason for asking. Where Reynolds was coming from, what he was doing there, how long he planned to stay, whether he had anything on him he was not supposed to have. Reynolds stayed calm and kept the interaction narrow. He did not volunteer background. He did not start explaining his life. He asked again for the legal basis. At that point, Hart shifted from commands to control language. He told Reynolds he was being detained. Still no stated reason. Still no statute. Still no articulated suspicion that could be written down and defended later. This was the moment the power chess game became obvious. Hart was testing whether Reynolds would fold just because a uniform demanded it. Reynolds was testing whether Hart would put a real legal claim on the record. Because once a reason is stated, it can be checked. It can be compared to policy. It can be challenged. Hart did not want a reason on the record. Reynolds asked the kind of questions that forced clarity without raising the temperature. Whether he was free to leave, whether there was a specific crime being investigated, whether Hart had reasonable suspicion. He asked it with the same steady tone, because steady tone matters. It keeps the story about process, not attitude. Hart did not answer cleanly. He kept circling back to ID. Around them, the park did what parks do. People watched without wanting trouble. Then people started noticing the pattern. A uniform standing over a black man who was seated and calm. Repeated demands. No explanation. That draws attention fast. A teenager on a bench angled a phone toward the interaction. A food truck worker looked up and paused mid-task. A jogger slowed down on the path. A woman with a stroller stopped and stared long enough to confirm what she was seeing. Hart noticed the phones, and that changed him. His voice did not get quieter. His posture got tighter. He started talking like he wanted to end the conversation before it became a documented problem. The pressure tactics shifted. Less fishing, more force. More reminders that he had authority. More insistence that Reynolds comply now and ask questions later. Reynolds did not take the bait. He did not stand. He did not reach into pockets without warning. He kept his hands visible and his movements minimal. That detail matters because it removed every excuse Hart could later use to justify escalation. Hart tried a different angle. He implied Reynolds' presence was suspicious without naming what made it suspicious. He hinted at park issues and vague complaints without referencing any actual call. He suggested Reynolds should just cooperate if he had nothing to hide. This is where the mask started slipping. Hart made it about belonging. Not loudly, not with slurs, with that familiar tone that frames a black person as an interruption in a public space. The kind of wording that signals the real motive without ever admitting it. The moment sounded like a warning dressed up as routine policing, and the crowd heard it. So did Reynolds. Reynolds' job was not to win arguments with local officers. His job was to complete an assignment without exposing it. But there is a line where an unlawful detention becomes a direct threat to the mission. Time matters. Movement matters. If Hart decided to take Reynolds to a station, the assignment could get compromised. If Reynolds disappeared from his position, someone else in the operation could be put at risk. Reynolds stayed in control, but his calculation changed. He had given Hart multiple chances to articulate a lawful reason. Hart had refused every time. That meant this was not about public safety. This was about control. Now, Reynolds had to choose between protecting the assignment by staying undercover or stopping an unlawful detention by revealing just enough authority to end it. He chose the option that preserved the mission and created a record. Reynolds told Hart he needed to confirm something and that he was going to reach slowly. He kept his movements deliberate. He reached toward the one item that could end the entire performance in seconds, and he did it in a way that no reasonable person could frame as threatening. Hart watched his hands. The bystanders kept recording. And right before Reynolds revealed who he actually was, Hart made one more attempt to force compliance without justification, like he could still win this by sheer insistence. That was the last move Hart made before the board flipped. Reynolds stayed seated and kept the pace slow because he understood something Hart did not seem to care about. Every extra second of an unjustified detention in public, on camera, made the aftermath worse for the department. Reynolds made one controlled movement, then identified himself as a federal agent and confirmed he was on an authorized assignment. The change in Officer Hart was immediate. His posture loosened, his voice softened, the hard edge disappeared. He stopped talking like he was in charge of a suspect and started talking like he was dealing with an inconvenient mistake. He framed it as confusion. He implied it was routine. He tried to walk the interaction backward without leaving a clear reason on camera for why he started it in the first place. That flip told everyone watching exactly what this had been about. Hart had been comfortable applying pressure when he believed Reynolds had no power to push back. The second Reynolds revealed authority that could reach beyond the local department, Hart wanted out. Hart ended the detention fast. No citation, no warning, no investigation, no documentation offered. Just a sudden release and an attempt to make the whole thing disappear. Reynolds did not get pulled into a victory lap. He did not argue. He did not demand an apology in the park. He kept it procedural. He confirmed he was being released, confirmed there was no allegation, and then he disengaged cleanly. He did it like someone who knew this was not going to be handled in the grass and noise of a lunch crowd. It was going to be handled in offices, with footage, logs, and policy. Then he went back to his assignment. The bystanders did what people do now. They kept their recordings. A couple of them exchanged contact info. The teenager who had been filming did not chase Hart. He just kept the camera steady long enough to capture the moment Hart's tone changed, and the detention ended with nothing to justify it. Reynolds did not need a crowd to chant for him. He needed a clean record. He had it. Within days, the recordings moved where they were supposed to move. Internal Affairs received multiple submissions. Some came from civilians, some came from within the department, because body camera footage exists for a reason, even when people wish it did not. Internal Affairs started with the simplest question. If Hart claimed this was prompted by something, where was the trigger? They checked dispatch. No call, no complaint, no request for officer response, no radio traffic consistent with the reported issue in that area at that time. Then they checked the report system. There was no stop report, no field interview card, no documented detention, no narrative explaining reasonable suspicion. Nothing that would justify why a man on a bench was ordered to stand and produce ID and told he was detained. That absence was the problem, because the cameras showed Hart making the stop. The cameras showed Hart escalating. The cameras showed him using detention language, and the department had nothing on paper to match it. Internal Affairs did what good investigators do next. They went beyond the single incident. They pulled Hart's activity history and started looking for a pattern that matched what they just saw. Stops that began aggressively, stayed vague, and ended abruptly without documentation. They found it. Over and over, Hart was recorded initiating stop and release encounters in public spaces. Parks, sidewalks, transit areas. Places where presence could be framed as suspicion if nobody demanded a reason. The common thread was not arrests, it was control. Hart would approach, demand compliance, and then disengage once the person pressed for legal justification or once a phone appeared. The moment recording was obvious, his tone would shift, and the stop would end without a report. And another thread showed up as well. The people most often targeted in these vague stops were Black. Internal Affairs expanded the inquiry into a formal misconduct investigation. That meant prior complaints that had been closed as unfounded or no evidence got reopened. Not because anyone suddenly cared about old paperwork, but because now there was a reference incident with video, timestamps, and a clear lack of lawful basis. When you have a clear anchor case, the past starts making sense. Supervisors were interviewed. Hart's body cam audits were reviewed. The department's own policies were compared to Hart's behavior. The investigators did not need to guess intent. They focused on what could be proven. Repeated failures to articulate reasonable suspicion, repeated detentions without documented cause, repeated pattern stops ending once oversight appeared. Hart was placed on administrative leave. Inside the department, the conversation changed. Not publicly, not with press conferences, but internally where careers and policy live. Some people called it a misunderstanding at first because that word is useful. It makes problems sound accidental. It makes accountability feel optional. Internal Affairs did not treat it like a misunderstanding. They treated it like a repeated practice that finally collided with a case too clean to brush away. And this time, the person on the bench was not just a civilian with no access to institutional pressure. He was a federal agent who could confirm, without drama, that the stop was unlawful from the start and that there was no excuse available after the fact. That fact did not make Reynolds special. It just made the incident impossible to bury. Internal Affairs did not treat Hart's stop in Harborview Park as a single bad moment. They treated it as a test case that exposed a repeat behavior. They built the investigation the way it holds up later. Timeline first, evidence second, policy comparison third, pattern last. They locked down the Harborview Park timeline from every angle. Bodycam, any nearby city cameras, witness submissions. They matched it to dispatch logs and confirmed there was no call for service tied to Reynolds. No complaint. No radio traffic that would explain why Hart initiated contact. Then they compared Hart's on-camera conduct to policy. The problem was not subtle. Hart issued commands and escalated to detention language without articulating a lawful basis. He did not document the stop. He did not cite a statute. He did not show reasonable suspicion on record. That alone was enough for sustained findings. But internal affairs kept going because the park footage raised a bigger question. If he did this when there were witnesses and cameras everywhere, what did he do when there were fewer eyes? They pulled more footage and more incidents. Same structure, different locations. Hart approached people in public spaces, made immediate demands, asked personal questions, and used pressure to force compliance. When people pushed back by asking for legal justification, he shifted tactics. When recording was visible, he ended the encounter quickly. Again and again, the stops ended without reports, without citations, without arrests. That pattern mattered because it exposed intent without anyone needing to read his mind. A lawful stop can be explained and documented. A stop built on control usually cannot. Internal Affairs reopened prior complaints. Some were from people who had never been arrested, never cited, and never even told what they supposedly did wrong. The old closures started to look different when the investigators had a documented example of Hart initiating detentions without cause and leaving no paperwork. They also reviewed supervision. Hart's volume of public contacts was high compared to peers, while his documentation was low. That is an obvious mismatch. The department could not claim it had no warning signs. It had data, but it wasn't using it the way it should have. The misconduct findings went up the chain. Hart was interviewed. He tried to justify the stop as checking suspicious behavior, but he could not point to any behavior that met the standard. He referenced general park concerns, but there was no call. He implied safety reasons, but he never articulated them during the encounter. The cameras showed a stop that started as a command and ended as a retreat the moment Reynolds identified federal authority. When that interview was compared against video and logs, the credibility gap widened. Hart was terminated. He appealed, and the appeal failed. The department's decision held because it was built on the cleanest kind of proof: what he did, what he said, and what he did not document. His certification was flagged. That meant the career impact went beyond one department. He was no longer just a local officer who could quietly transfer to another badge and repeat the same pattern. Then came the part departments usually avoid talking about: what they did wrong. They acknowledged policy failures in supervision and oversight, not as a public performance, but as a necessary admission inside the system that allowed a pattern to grow. Reforms were implemented with specific controls designed to prevent exactly this kind of stop from staying invisible. They increased body camera audits with targeted review for officers who initiated a high number of stops without corresponding reports. They required on-camera articulation of reasonable suspicion for detentions, not after the fact, not in a supervisor's office, but in the moment when it actually mattered. They expanded supervisory review for repeat stop and release behavior and created earlier intervention steps. When patterns appeared, they reinforced training on constitutional standards with scenario-based evaluations that focused on documentation, lawful basis, and de-escalation, not just officer presence. Harborview Park did not become a viral headline. There was no national debate cycle, no trending clip, no influencer commentary. The outcome was quieter and, in some ways, more serious. The system corrected itself because it had no room to deny what the record showed. Reynolds completed his FBI assignment without compromise. He did not need to win in public to get justice. He needed the documentation to reach the right place. And it did. The final lesson from this case was simple. When authority cannot state its legal basis, it collapses the moment oversight shows up. Not because someone got loud, but because the facts left nowhere to hide. So here's the question for you. If you were sitting on that bench and an officer demanded your ID with no reason, would you know what to ask, and would you stay calm enough to keep the record clean? If you've experienced something like this or witnessed it, share what happened in the comments. And if you want more stories where dignity, documentation, and accountability win without theatrics, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.
Stay right there. Don't move.
Why you stop me?
I'm checking the vehicle.
I provided my documents. I do not consent to any search of my vehicle.
If there's nothing to hide, this is quick.
You're searching without consent and without explaining why. I want a supervisor.
An 8-year patrol officer decided a black man in a luxury BMW had to be doing something wrong, and he tried to turn a nothing stop into a big arrest through pure intimidation. What he didn't know was that the calm driver he was trying to corner wasn't just any citizen. He was a sitting federal judge who understood exactly how unlawful stops fall apart, and he was already building a record that would cost people their jobs, their careers, and their excuses. At this moment, I want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Before we rewind, tell us where you're watching from, your country or your state, in the comments. And if you like stories where bias meets accountability and the truth is caught on camera, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, here's what was happening when things got tense. Officer Daniel Reese had his patrol car angled behind a black BMW on the shoulder, under streetlights near a busy shopping corridor. His body camera was running, his dash camera was running. Passing traffic was steady. There were storefronts nearby with security cameras pointed toward the road. Reese was already past professional stop mode. He had ordered the driver out quickly before offering a clear reason. He positioned himself like the stop was dangerous, even though there had been no speeding, no swerving, no broken light, no plate issue, and no alert tied to the vehicle. His posture and tone were built for control, not clarity. The driver, Judge Michael Harrington, didn't match Reese's energy. Harrington moved slowly, kept his hands visible, and did exactly what a careful person did when a situation felt wrong. He complied physically while demanding a legal basis verbally. He handed over his license and registration when asked. He repeated the same question in different ways, calm every time, making sure the cameras captured it. Reese refused to give a clean answer. He avoided anything that sounded like a real traffic reason because there wasn't one. Instead, he dragged the moment out, asking extra questions, taking long pauses, and trying to make Harrington fill the silence. That's a common tactic. If the officer can't justify the stop, the next move is to fish for something else. Harrington didn't give him anything. No arguing, no sudden movements, no insulting language, no emotional outburst Reese could later describe as aggressive. Harrington kept his voice level and his words specific. He made it clear he did not consent to any searches. He requested a supervisor. He repeated that he wanted the lawful reason stated on the record. That's when Reese started pushing harder. He claimed he needed to confirm the vehicle wasn't stolen, but he didn't cite a report. He didn't cite a matching description. He didn't cite a dispatch hit. He didn't cite a tag return that raised suspicion. He just acted like the car itself was suspicious because of who was driving it. Harrington's calm didn't soften Reese. It irritated him, because calm doesn't feel like submission. Calm feels like resistance when someone is trying to dominate the moment. Reese circled the BMW as if he was hunting for an excuse he could point to later. He shined his light into the cabin. He stared at the VIN area. He looked for anything that could be framed as probable cause. He didn't find it. So he tried the next step: pressure. He implied that cooperation would make this go faster. He hinted at consequences without naming them. He made it sound like Harrington had something to hide simply because he was asserting rights. That's the move. Turn basic legal boundaries into suspicion. But Harrington didn't shift. He continued doing the one thing that makes bad stops dangerous for the officer involved. He kept the interaction clean. He gave Reese no behavior problem to use as cover. He kept returning to the same point. The reason for the stop had to exist before the stop, not be invented afterward. And here's the part people miss when they watch these clips online. This wasn't just an argument on the roadside. This was a power contest over the narrative. Reese wanted the stop to become a story that justified itself. Harrington wanted the stop to stay exactly what it was, a decision made first and rationalized later. The cameras were the referee. Reese held Harrington's ID longer than necessary, studying it like he was hoping it would magically become fake if he stared at it long enough. Harrington didn't flinch. He kept his hands visible. He stayed measured. He kept requesting the supervisor. He kept stating non-consent to search. Reese returned to the vehicle. The Bodycam audio caught the shift in his breathing and pacing. He was reaching the point where his assumption had produced nothing, and he still needed an outcome that let him feel like he won the stop. This is where the stop stopped being routine and started becoming a case. Because once an officer makes a stop with no lawful basis, every minute after that becomes risk. If they let the person go, they feel embarrassed. If they keep going, they dig deeper. And if they cross a line on camera, the footage doesn't care about their pride. Reese went back toward the BMW, and he moved like he'd made a decision. And Harrington, without raising his voice, kept doing the same thing that was driving Reese crazy. He stayed composed, stayed factual, and kept the record clear. Reese made the move that officers only make when they don't have a real reason to hold someone, and they still want control. He told Harrington he was going to search the BMW anyway, as if saying it confidently would turn it into lawful authority. Harrington didn't step into the trap. He didn't get loud. He didn't reach. He didn't argue about the search itself in a way that would look like resistance. He did the smart thing. He stated clearly and repeatedly that he did not consent, and he asked again for the legal basis to be stated on camera. Reese refused to give one. He kept it vague on purpose. He leaned on general phrases, the kind that sound official but don't actually explain anything. He acted like the stop was about confirming ownership, yet he hadn't started with any legitimate traffic reason, hadn't gotten a hit from dispatch, and hadn't pointed to any specific indicator that the car was stolen. Then he went hands-on with the vehicle. He opened the door and started looking through the cabin. Not a quick glance, not a focused safety check. It was a search in the plain meaning of the word, moving items, checking compartments, looking under seats. He did it slowly, like he was hoping something would appear if he took long enough. Harrington stood near the shoulder with his hands visible, watching without moving closer. He kept his posture neutral. He kept requesting a supervisor. He kept asking for the reason. And he made sure his words were measured, the kind of tone that plays well later when someone watches the footage without context. Reese tried pressure again. He suggested that if Harrington just cooperated, he'd be on his way. He implied Harrington was prolonging this by asserting rights. He framed it like a favor being offered. Harrington didn't accept the framing. He stayed on one track. Consent was denied, and the officer needed lawful cause, not attitude. Reese walked back to his cruiser and called for backup. That detail mattered because it showed what he was building. Numbers. When a stop is weak, officers sometimes stack the scene with uniforms and hope the visual makes the citizen fold. A second unit arrived within minutes. The second officer didn't take over. He took a position. He watched Harrington more than he watched Reese. That was the silent message. The driver was the problem, not the lack of a reason. Reese went back to the BMW and expanded the search. He popped the trunk. He moved through bags and personal items with the kind of casual disregard that doesn't look like investigation and does look like punishment. He checked places where nothing about a stolen car concern would logically require him to look. And still, nothing. No tools, no altered VIN plate, no mismatched registration, no contraband, no evidence that matched the assumption that started this. At this stage, the power game got obvious. Reese didn't have a stop. He had a story he wanted to be true, and every minute that passed without evidence made his position weaker, not stronger. On camera, it didn't look like policing. It looked like fishing. Harrington stayed steady. He didn't mock him. He didn't say the words that would turn the moment into a shouting match. He simply kept asking for what every lawful stop requires, an articulated reason. Reese's responses got shorter and sharper. He started acting like Harrington's calm was disrespect. That's a common flip. When intimidation fails, the next tactic is to label composure as defiance. A few cars slowed as they passed. A bystander across the street raised a phone and pointed it towards the shoulder. Storefront cameras covered the area. Reese didn't seem to care or didn't realize how much coverage he was standing in. Either way, the record was growing. Reese then did another thing that mattered. He held on to Harrington's license again, longer than necessary, like he was searching for an excuse inside the plastic. He told the second officer to run checks again. The returns came back clean. That should have been the end. Clean checks, no evidence, no legitimate reason for the stop in the first place. A professional officer de-escalates, documents, and clears the scene. Reese didn't. Instead, he tried to manufacture a reason after the fact. He switched from stolen vehicle to identity issue because he needed something to justify the time, the search, and the posture he had taken from the first second. He began suggesting the identification didn't look right. He started talking about impersonation in a way that made it sound like he had discovered something serious, even though he hadn't discovered anything new at all. Harrington responded the same way he had all night, calm, precise, and focused on the legal basis. He did not consent to further search. He requested the supervisor again. He stated that the stop had no lawful foundation. That's when Sergeant Lana Ortiz arrived. Ortiz walked in and took one look at the scene. 2 patrol cars, a luxury BMW, a calm driver standing off to the side, and Reese acting like he was in the middle of a major arrest. She asked Reese what the original basis was. Reese gave her something vague. He leaned on suspicion without specifics. He tried to sell it like instinct and experience. He also tried to frame Harrington as difficult, because that's the easy way to justify escalation. Ortiz then spoke with Harrington briefly. She heard the same clear points. No traffic violation, no consent to search, repeated requests for the legal basis, and compliance without aggression. She didn't get theatrics. She got a record. And now Ortiz had a choice. Supervisors either correct the officer in the moment or protect the officer and hope nobody ever sees the footage. Ortiz didn't immediately shut it down, but she also didn't fully endorse Reese's behavior. She asked what evidence Reese had that the ID was fraudulent. Reese didn't have evidence. He had irritation and a need to be right. The search was already done. It had already produced nothing. The checks had already come back clean. The cameras had already captured the timeline. Reese was running out of room. So he did what some people do when they realize they can't win on facts. He tried to win by force of accusation. He turned the stop into a claim that Harrington was lying about who he was. And that was the moment the entire encounter shifted from unlawful to catastrophic. Because now Reese wasn't just overstepping. He was setting up a charge that could only exist if someone ignored the obvious truth. Reese committed to the new story because the old one had failed. He told Sergeant Ortiz that Harrington's identification looked suspicious and that Harrington was claiming a status he couldn't verify. He framed it like a public safety issue instead of admitting the stop had started with nothing. He pointed at the BMW, then at the paperwork, trying to make the scene itself look like proof. Harrington stayed controlled. He explained who he was without raising his voice. He repeated that he had complied, that there had been no traffic violation, and that Reese had searched without consent. He asked Ortiz to stop the detention unless Reese could state a lawful basis on camera. Ortiz asked Reese for something concrete to justify the arrest threat. Reese didn't produce evidence. He produced certainty. He acted like confidence could replace probable cause. Then he did the thing that ends careers. He escalated to handcuffs to force the situation to look serious. Reese ordered Harrington to turn around and place him in custody for what he described as fraudulent identification and impersonation. It was a charge built on nothing but the officer's refusal to accept the truth in front of him. The second officer stood by and didn't intervene. Ortiz didn't physically stop it. She let it happen, and that decision became part of the later fallout. Harrington didn't resist. He didn't argue in a way that would muddy the video. He stated calmly that the arrest was unlawful and that the cameras would show it. He also requested that the supervisors preserve the recordings and dispatch logs. That was the chess move. Harrington wasn't trying to win roadside. He was locking the record so nobody could rewrite it later. At the station, the tone changed fast. A desk supervisor took the paperwork, looked at the name, and paused. Another staff member checked internal directories. Within minutes, phone calls started moving up the chain. The normal booking rhythm broke. Reese tried to keep acting like it was routine, but the station didn't treat it like routine. Someone asked Reese for the original basis of the stop. He gave the same vague language he'd used on the shoulder. The problem was that vague doesn't survive video. And now everyone knew there was video. Harrington was held briefly while identities were verified through official channels. Once confirmation came back, the department faced a choice: double down on the arrest or unwind it immediately before the paperwork became permanent. They unwound it. Harrington was released without the officer's story ever being supported by an actual violation, an alert, or evidence from the search. But the damage was already done, and Harrington didn't leave quietly in the legal sense. He left with names, times, badge numbers, and a clear understanding of what the footage would show when requested. Within days, formal preservation letters went out. Bodycam, dashcam, dispatch audio, CAD logs, and nearby business footage were requested before anything could be lost. A civil rights attorney got involved early, not to posture, but to control the timeline and the evidence. Then the recording spoke. The footage showed no traffic violation. It showed Reese ordering Harrington out without a clear reason. It captured Harrington's repeated non-consent to search. It captured a search that produced nothing. And it captured the pivot into identity claims only after the officer came up empty. That is the part departments can't spin, because it isn't opinion, it's sequence. The story spread beyond the city once people realized who the driver was and what the cameras captured. The department tried to contain it internally at first, but the moment it reached outside oversight, containment stopped being an option. The department tried to treat it like an embarrassing mistake that could be handled quietly. They failed, because this wasn't the kind of incident that stayed local once the record was preserved. Harrington didn't do media first. He did paperwork first. Within days, his legal team filed preservation demands and formal requests tied to the stop: bodycam, dashcam, dispatch audio, CAD logs, supervisor notes, and any internal messages about the incident. That mattered because departments sometimes summarize incidents before the raw footage gets reviewed. Harrington's team cut that off early by locking the evidence trail. Then the civil rights lawsuit landed. It wasn't written like a speech. It was written like a map. It laid out the timeline: no traffic violation, no articulable suspicion, an extended detention without lawful basis, a non-consensual search, then a fabricated pivot into identity accusations after the search came up empty. The claim wasn't just that Reese was rude. The claim was that Reese violated constitutional standards and then tried to cover the failure with criminal allegations. Once that filing hit, federal attention followed fast because the facts were clean and the footage was clear. The city's first move was predictable. They placed Reese on administrative leave, announced an internal review, and emphasized that the department took the matter seriously. That language is designed to buy time. Time didn't help them because the investigation didn't stay inside the building. A parallel federal inquiry opened, and that is where the stop stopped being about one officer. Investigators asked for complaint histories, prior stop data, and patterns tied to vehicle searches and suspicious ID claims. They looked for how often Reese initiated stops without clear traffic reasons, how often he searched, and how often supervisors signed off afterward. That's where the real problem surfaced. There were prior complaints. People had reported being stopped without clear reasons, being questioned like they were suspects first and drivers second, and being searched after refusing consent. Some complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings. Some had been marked not sustained due to insufficient evidence. Now the evidence existed and it matched the complaints. Supervisory complicity became the next issue. Sergeant Ortiz wasn't the only one who had been on scenes like that. Command staff had seen patterns in numbers, or at minimum, they had been responsible for not looking at them. The department's oversight structure showed a familiar failure. Complaints were treated like PR problems, not early warning signals. With the footage public and the lawsuit active, the city's risk calculation flipped. The question wasn't, can we defend this? It was, how much worse does this get if we try? Reese was terminated. His badge and authority were gone. But that wasn't the end, because termination is employment. The investigations were criminal and civil rights related. An indictment followed. The charging theory wasn't complicated. It focused on the unlawful detention, the unlawful search, and the false statements used to justify escalation. The case didn't rely on opinions about bias. It relied on sequence, policy, and what the officer said and did on recording compared to what he later claimed. Reese's defense tried to frame it as good faith policing, but the gap between the footage and the paperwork was too big. A jury doesn't need to be a constitutional scholar to understand when a reason is invented after the fact. The city, meanwhile, faced the civil case math. Settlement talks were not just about Harrington. They were about precedent. The moment a city admits a stop was pretextual and discriminatory on a clean record. It triggers copycat filings and reopens old ones. The city tried to limit exposure, but the federal inquiry was already digging into patterns, and that forced broader concessions. A major settlement was reached. The number was large enough that it couldn't be explained as nuisance. It was damages, legal fees, and the cost of failing to supervise. The payout hit the budget, but the bigger cost was structural. The department was placed under a federal consent decree. That meant external oversight with mandatory reforms, not optional training memos. The consent decree required tighter stop documentation, stricter supervisory review of searches, better Bodycam compliance audits, early warning systems for repeat complaints, and data monitoring tied to race and outcomes. It also forced a change in how complaints were classified and investigated because not sustained stopped being a convenient trash bin when the department could be audited. Then the past came back. Dozens of cases connected to Reese, and a small circle of officers were flagged for review, especially arrests where the initial stop reason was unclear, or where searches were justified with vague language. Defense attorneys started filing motions. Prosecutors started reviewing whether evidence had been obtained lawfully. Some convictions were challenged. Some charges were dropped. Some plea deals were questioned. Even when cases didn't overturn, the department's credibility took damage in courtrooms. Inside the department, people reacted in two ways. Some officers were angry that Reese made them look bad. Others were angry that supervisors had let it go on long enough to blow up the whole department. Quietly, plenty of officers understood the real lesson. The problem wasn't just that Reese made a biased assumption. The problem was that he felt protected enough to escalate search and fabricate on camera. Harrington didn't treat it like a personal victory lap. He treated it like a rule of law correction. He didn't claim the system was perfect now. He didn't pretend one consent decree fixed decades. But he made sure one thing was clear. When documentation exists and a person refuses to be bullied into silence, the usual escape routes close fast. And here's what I want to ask you. If you were in that position, would you have stayed as calm as Harrington did, knowing the goal was to bait you into a reaction? Or would you have argued in a way that gave the officer something to use later? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced a stop that felt pretextual, share what happened, as much as you're comfortable sharing. And if you want more stories where accountability wins and the record speaks louder than excuses, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.
All right, stay right there. Do not move toward the vehicle.
I don't consent to any search of my vehicle.
What's all this paperwork? What are you hiding?
Those are my work documents. Please stop throwing my property on the road.
Kruger, stop where you are. Face me.
Sergeant, what's this about?
You are being detained pending investigation. Do not reach for anything.
I didn't do anything. This is a misunderstanding.
Turn around. Hands behind your back.
Officer Mason Kruger had Darnell Brooks standing on the shoulder with his hands visible, while the silver Mercedes sat gutted like a storage unit that got raided. Papers were spread across the pavement. A wallet case, a set of gym earbuds, and a folder of work documents were all out in the open. Kruger kept moving fast, talking louder than he needed to, narrating the mess like he was trying to convince the night that he'd found a criminal. What Kruger didn't understand was that Darnell wasn't panicking because he wasn't hiding anything. He was calm because he'd seen this kind of stop before, and he knew the real danger wasn't a ticket. The danger was an officer deciding the outcome first and working backward. And at this moment, we want to tell you this. We're genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. So tell us where you're watching from, what city or state. And if you watch stories where dignity, receipts, and accountability win, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's rewind, because this didn't start with a search. It started with a look. Earlier that evening, Darnell Brooks had been driving home in his silver Mercedes, steady pace, no music blasting, no erratic moves. He looked like what he was, a working professional heading back after a long day, focused and quiet. Nothing about his driving screamed trouble. Officer Mason Kruger still pulled him over. Kruger used one of those vague reasons that left room for anything later. He claimed a minor traffic issue and treated it like a big deal from the first step out of his patrol car. He didn't walk up like a person doing a routine stop. He walked up like he'd already decided what kind of man Darnell was. Kruger's first questions weren't about the reason for the stop. He focused on the vehicle, the price of it, and the idea that Darnell didn't match it. He kept circling the same point in different ways, pushing for a slip-up, pushing for a story, pushing for an opening. Darnell gave him nothing. He stayed polite. He kept his tone even. He handed over the documents he was supposed to. He didn't argue about the stop right there because he understood the dynamic. On the roadside, the officer controlled the pace. Darnell controlled his own discipline. That's when Kruger shifted tactics. Kruger started describing Darnell as suspicious without anything concrete. He said Darnell looked nervous. He claimed Darnell was moving too much. He talked about officer safety while doing things that had nothing to do with safety. He asked where Darnell was coming from, where he was going, why he was in that area, and why he was driving that SUV. It was interrogation disguised as small talk. Darnell answered what he had to and stayed quiet where he could. He didn't volunteer extra details. He didn't try to win Kruger over. He kept his hands visible and his posture controlled, the way trained people do when they're dealing with someone looking for a reason. Kruger then told Darnell to step out of the vehicle. Darnell complied, slowly and clearly, because he knew sudden moves get rewritten later. Kruger positioned him in a way that made the scene look more dangerous than it was, like he wanted a certain picture if anyone drove by. Then Kruger went hands-on. He patted Darnell down. Not a quick check. Not a professional sweep and done. Kruger made it a performance. He moved with extra pressure, acting like he expected to find something. Darnell didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He didn't give Kruger the reaction Kruger seemed to want. When the pat-down produced nothing, Kruger did what officers aren't supposed to do unless they have a lawful reason. He moved straight into the SUV. He didn't ask and wait for consent. He didn't present a clear reason that matched what the camera would later show. He just started searching, and he searched like someone trying to create a scene, not like someone checking a specific concern. He opened compartments. He pulled paperwork from the center console. He dumped items from the glove box. He flipped through a folder like he was hoping something would fall out. He opened the back area and shifted personal items around. He made the interior look like chaos, because chaos makes it easier to claim anything later. Darnell immediately stated clearly that he did not consent to any search. He didn't shout it. He didn't turn it into a speech. He repeated it in a steady voice because he wanted it on the recording. He also asked for the reason Kruger believed he could search. He asked for the legal basis in a way that sounded calm, not challenging, because he understood how quickly challenging gets labeled as aggressive. Kruger brushed him off and kept going. This is where the chess game started. Kruger acted like Darnell's calm was suspicious. He acted like asking questions was suspicious. He used the common routine. Talk fast, move fast, keep the other person off balance, and control the narrative. He kept saying phrases that would sound good later, even if they didn't match what was happening. Darnell countered without escalating. He stayed still. He kept his hands visible. He tracked what Kruger touched, and he said short, factual statements meant for the body cam. That Kruger had opened certain areas, that he had moved certain items, that Darnell had not been asked for consent, and that he had refused consent. He also made it clear he wanted a supervisor on scene. Kruger didn't like that. He snapped back with more authority talk, more implied threats. He suggested Darnell was making things worse for himself. He implied that cooperation meant submission. He tried to pressure Darnell into saying something that could be twisted into probable cause. Darnell did not give him that. The longer the search dragged on, the uglier Kruger's energy got. There was a moment where Kruger stopped searching with any logic and started searching out of frustration. That frustration had a specific source. The SUV wasn't giving him what he wanted. No weapon, no stolen property, no hidden cash, no obvious contraband. Just the normal reality of a working adult's vehicle. Documents, personal items, everyday stuff. But Kruger didn't slow down and reset. He doubled down. He dumped more paperwork onto the ground. He scattered more items. He created a bigger mess, and the mess itself became part of his strategy. If the scene looked like a major discovery was coming, he could justify why he'd gone so far. Darnell watched it all and kept his voice controlled. He repeated that he wanted a supervisor. He repeated that he did not consent. He made sure his body language stayed neutral, because he understood something simple. In stops like this, the officer often wants two things: control and a reaction. Darnell refused to give him either. That's when Kruger stepped away from the SUV briefly, like he was thinking. Then he went back in, moving faster again, targeting the same spots he'd already searched, acting like he remembered something he'd conveniently forgotten. His tone changed too, less annoyed, more focused, like he'd decided the stop was not ending without a result. And Darnell noticed the shift right away, because trained people notice when the pattern changes. By this point, Kruger had already called for someone to come out, framing it like he needed support for a suspicious vehicle stop. Darnell knew what that meant. A second officer could either stop the nonsense, or it could turn into a group routine where they validate each other. Either way, the body cam was rolling, traffic was passing, and the scene looked worse by the minute. Kruger's whole posture changed the moment he decided the search wasn't going to fail. He went back into the SUV and started reworking the same areas he'd already torn through, moving with urgency like he was racing a clock. He kept talking louder than before, explaining his actions out loud as if volume could replace facts. Darnell stayed in the same spot on the shoulder, hands visible, body still. He didn't step forward. He didn't try to stop the search physically. He knew exactly how that would be written up later. What he did do was keep marking the timeline in a calm voice for the recording. He noted that Kruger had already searched those spots. He noted that Kruger had removed items and placed them on the ground. He noted again that he had not given consent. Kruger didn't respond to the facts. He responded to the tone. He told Darnell to stop talking. He warned him about obstruction in that familiar way officers use when they want silence, not safety. Then Kruger leaned into the open door, blocked the view with his body for a moment, and straightened up with something small in his gloved hand. A little bag. He held it up like a prize and immediately tried to lock the story in place. He acted like it had been sitting there the whole time, like it had practically introduced itself. Darnell didn't react the way Kruger wanted. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He didn't give a dramatic denial. He looked at the bag, looked at the mess, and then calmly stated that the item had not been there when the vehicle was opened. He repeated that the officer had already searched that area. He repeated that he did not consent. And he asked again for a supervisor. That was the moment Kruger's confidence slipped. Not because he suddenly cared about right and wrong, because Darnell's calm made it hard to sell the caught red-handed story. A panicking suspect makes the officer look heroic. A steady adult narrating the inconsistencies makes the officer look reckless. Kruger tried to reset control by shifting into custody mode. He moved closer to Darnell, told him to turn around, and started reaching for restraints like the decision had already been made. Darnell complied with the positioning but kept his head up. He didn't resist. He didn't stiffen. He didn't do anything that could be twisted into aggression. He kept repeating one key point. The bag was not his, and the search had been non-consensual and chaotic. Kruger then did something that showed he wasn't thinking like a careful officer. He started narrating charges before he had any clean procedure in place. He started treating the stop like a win he could celebrate. That's when Sergeant Elena Ramirez arrived. Sergeant Elena Ramirez pulled up, got out, and immediately took in the scene with the kind of quiet focus that comes from experience. The Mercedes interior was dumped. The ground was scattered with documents and personal items. Kruger was standing too close to Darnell, with the bag held up like a prop. Ramirez didn't match Kruger's energy. She didn't accept his story on arrival just because he wore the uniform. She did what good supervisors do first. She slowed everything down. She separated the conversation. She had Kruger step back and explain, and she had Darnell remain where he was, keeping the scene controlled. Ramirez asked the basic questions that should have already been answered cleanly on body camera. What was the original reason for the stop? What specifically created probable cause when the search began, where the bag was found, and why the vehicle looked like it had been emptied onto the road? Kruger gave answers, but they didn't land right. His explanation leaned on vague claims and gut-feeling language. He kept describing Darnell as nervous and suspicious. He kept framing the SUV itself as suspicious. He kept talking about high crime and officer safety without connecting it to any specific, observable facts. Ramirez looked at the vehicle again. She looked at the spread of items on the ground. Then she looked at Darnell, and she did something that cut straight through the performance. She ran the identification properly, not a quick glance, not a half check. She called it in and waited for confirmation because the stop had already escalated past the point where lazy procedure was acceptable. While she did that, Darnell stayed calm and cooperative. He identified himself in a measured way, including his employment status, without using it like a threat. He didn't demand special treatment. He didn't posture. He simply made it clear that he was a federal law enforcement officer and that the situation was being documented in real time. Kruger tried to talk over that. He minimized it. He acted like it didn't matter. He pushed the idea that contraband was contraband and that he could handle it his way. Ramirez didn't bite. She kept her attention on verification. When dispatch came back, the tone changed fast. Darnell wasn't a random driver with a clean record. He wasn't a lucky stop. He wasn't someone Kruger could bully into a plea. He was an active Deputy United States Marshal, currently assigned, currently credentialed, and very much connected to systems that do not shrug off evidence planting. Ramirez's face didn't turn dramatic. It turned procedural. She didn't announce it to inflate Darnell. She acknowledged it because it changed the entire risk profile of what Kruger had just done. A bad stop was now potentially a federal-level problem. A questionable search was now potentially a criminal act. Ramirez then looked at the bag again and did something that mattered. She stopped treating it like a guaranteed fact. She asked Kruger to walk her through the exact discovery step by step, including where his hands were, what he moved, and why the same area was searched twice. She also asked why the vehicle's contents were dumped like that, because dumped contents create opportunity. Opportunity creates doubt. Doubt destroys prosecutions. Kruger's answers got worse. He became defensive. He tried to rush. He tried to frame Ramirez's questions as undermining him. He tried to push her into backing him automatically. Ramirez didn't back him automatically. She did the opposite. She told Kruger to stop touching anything. She directed him away from the open door. She moved to preserve the scene instead of working the scene. She also requested an additional unit and initiated the chain of notification that supervisors use when something looks like misconduct. Darnell watched all of it without celebrating. He didn't smirk. He didn't antagonize Kruger. He kept his voice even and his hands visible. The only thing he asked for was simple, that his personal items not be handled further, and that the interaction be treated as a serious integrity issue. Ramirez then addressed the biggest problem in front of her. The search itself looked like it had been designed to create a discovery rather than uncover one. The bag didn't appear in a clean, contained way. It appeared after a prolonged, aggressive rummage with the officer, blocking sightlines and revisiting areas already cleared. That detail mattered, and Ramirez knew it. She took possession of the bag in a controlled way, documented it, and prevented Kruger from narrating over the evidence process. Then she made a decision that Kruger wasn't expecting. She removed Kruger from the driver's side completely and put another officer in position to oversee. She treated Darnell as a detained citizen who needed to be handled properly, not as a trophy. And then she started asking the questions that don't get asked, unless a supervisor is already thinking about accountability. Whether Kruger's body camera had been on continuously, whether he had called out probable cause before entering the vehicle, and whether he had any prior contact with his driver. Kruger tried to regain control by insisting the case was simple. Ramirez didn't accept simple. She accepted clean. By the time the next unit arrived, Kruger's story had already started collapsing under its own weight. Not because Darnell argued, because Darnell stayed steady while the system finally did what it was supposed to do: verify, document, and supervise. Once Sergeant Elena Ramirez took control, the roadside stopped being a traffic stop and turned into a scene preservation problem. She separated Officer Mason Kruger from the vehicle and from Darnell. She had another unit stand with Darnell while she handled procedure, because she wasn't going to let Kruger keep shaping the story with movement and noise. Ramirez treated the bag like contested evidence, not a victory. She documented where it was presented, noted the condition of the interior, and made it clear on camera that the vehicle had been heavily disturbed before the bag appeared. She also required Kruger to stop giving a running narrative and answer direct, specific questions. Kruger could not keep his timeline straight. His explanations depended on vague claims and shifting details. He kept falling back on generalized suspicion instead of clear observations. Ramirez didn't argue with him. She simply recorded what he said and what the scene looked like. Then she made the calls that changed everything. She notified the watch commander. She requested internal affairs response. She requested a supervisor-to-supervisor contact report because the detained driver was a federal law enforcement officer. She also ensured that body camera footage was secured under protocol, so it could not be altered, delayed, or conveniently lost. Darnell did not try to win the moment on the shoulder. He stayed calm, stayed cooperative, and stayed factual. He provided his credentials properly. He asked for his property to be handled minimally because his documents and personal items were now scattered across a public roadway. He also stated clearly and repeatedly that the search had been non-consensual and that the bag appeared after multiple researches of the same areas. That mattered because it framed the situation for oversight in real time, not later, not after somebody had time to coordinate stories. Ramirez also did something else that sealed Kruger's problem. She started checking what the cameras would show instead of trusting what Kruger claimed. Kruger's body camera had been running, so had Ramirez's. Another responding unit's camera was running as well. A passing driver had slowed down earlier and recorded the scene from the traffic lane because the stop looked chaotic and excessive. That outside angle didn't capture everything, but it captured enough of Kruger's movements around the open door to raise serious questions. Within hours, Kruger was removed from duty pending investigation. He was ordered to surrender department equipment and submit to administrative procedure. He tried to act like it was just paperwork and that Ramirez was overreacting, but the department could not brush off an allegation of evidence planting, and they definitely could not brush it off when the target was a deputy United States Marshal and multiple cameras showed inconsistencies. Internal affairs moved fast because this was the kind of case that destroys a department in court. They pulled the full body camera files, the dispatch logs, the computer-aided dispatch notes, and Kruger's report drafts. They compared timestamps. They compared what he said he saw to what the cameras showed. They also looked at Kruger's history for patterns, stops that escalated without clear cause, searches that turned into messes, and arrests that depended heavily on his word. The bag itself became its own problem. Chain of custody was examined from the moment Kruger found it. The lab process documented handling and packaging. Investigators checked for prints and trace transfer. They also compared how Kruger described finding it to what the footage showed about where his hands were and when he blocked the view. The case didn't hinge on one dramatic moment. It hinged on accumulation. Every inconsistency stacked until the story could not stand. Darnell's calm played a role too. He made a detailed statement, not emotional, not personal, not a speech about the system. He described actions in order. He described what was moved and when. He described the escalation. He described how the bag appeared after repeated searching and after the scene had been turned into chaos. That statement matched the footage in the places where it mattered. Once the department realized they could not defend Kruger, the case moved into criminal territory. A local prosecutor filed charges tied to the misconduct, including evidence tampering and filing a false report. Because the conduct involved a deliberate attempt to turn an innocent person into a suspect through fabrication, federal authorities also took interest. The investigation expanded beyond a policy violation into questions of civil rights abuse and obstruction. Kruger was arrested, not on some dramatic public stage. It was procedural, controlled, and humiliating in the way that matters most to someone like him. He lost the uniform first. Then he lost the authority that came with it. Then he had to sit in the same system he used on other people and wait for decisions he could not control. In court, the case was simple because the footage was simple. The prosecution didn't need to overtalk it. They played the timeline. They showed the search turning into disorder. They showed the researching of areas already checked. They showed the bag appearing after Kruger blocked the view and then immediately narrated it as if it had always been there. They highlighted how his written statements conflicted with camera timestamps. They presented Sergeant Elena Ramirez as a witness who arrived without bias for either man and immediately recognized that the scene did not match a clean discovery. Kruger's defense tried the usual angles. They tried to paint it as a misunderstanding. They tried to argue that disorder happens during searches. They tried to imply Darnell's position gave him influence. None of that fixed the core problem. Kruger's story kept changing while the video stayed the same. The jury didn't need to guess motive. They only needed to decide whether the evidence was handled honestly. It wasn't. Kruger was convicted. He was sentenced to prison time. He was permanently separated from law enforcement. He also became the example department's fear. The officer whose career didn't end with quiet resignation, but with a conviction that followed him everywhere. Darnell's outcome wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. He filed the complaints the right way. He cooperated with investigators. He didn't turn it into a public circus. But the truth still traveled. Word spread through the community. Officers who had seen Kruger's behavior before suddenly felt safer speaking up. People who had felt powerless in stops like that saw something rare, an attempt to frame someone collapsing under oversight. The department also had to change, because the lawsuit risk was real and the credibility damage was worse. They tightened search documentation. They increased supervisor response requirements for escalated stops. They flagged patterns of consentless searches that ended with convenient discoveries. They reinforced body camera compliance with actual consequences. And Darnell quietly became the kind of person others asked for advice. Not advice on how to argue with police, advice on how to stay alive in the moment and still protect your future. Keep calm. Keep hands visible. Use short factual statements. Request oversight. Let the recording do the heavy lifting. That's the lesson here. When someone in power decides you're guilty first, they will try to manufacture the rest. The only thing that beats that is structure, calm behavior, clear documentation, and a system that is forced to look at what really happened. So now you tell us, if you were in Darnell's position, what would you have done differently, if anything? Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to push you into reacting so they could justify what they wanted to do? Drop your story in the comments, share this with someone who needs it, and if you want more stories where accountability actually lands, make sure you like and subscribe.
Good morning. I need to see some identification.
What is the reason?
We got a complaint. Just show me your ID and we're done.
What am I suspected of doing?
Stand up and step outside with me.
You have no lawful right to do this.
That doesn't matter. Stand up.
A patrol officer walked into a quiet downtown cafe and decided a black man reading by the window was the problem he needed to solve. He demanded identification right away, with no clear crime, no clear reason, and a body camera already running. The man at the table refused to play along with vague authority. He stayed seated, kept his hands visible, and kept asking the same basic procedural questions. The officer treated those questions like disrespect and started pushing the situation toward force. At this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now, quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you like stories where calm people use facts, recordings, and the system's own rules to hold power accountable, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This wasn't a viral stunt. It didn't start with shouting. It started with a routine morning and an officer who thought he could create a reason after the fact. The cafe was called Harbor and Stone, a downtown spot where people worked quietly, kept headphones in, and treated the place like a shared office. The staff knew the regulars. The cameras were visible if you paid attention. And the customers were the type who noticed things, but didn't get involved unless they had to. The man at the window was Julian Mercer. He looked like any other customer, clean clothes, calm posture, book open, coffee on the table. Nobody in that room knew he was a federal judge. He didn't carry himself like someone looking for a confrontation. He carried himself like someone who didn't want one. Around mid-morning, Officer Kyle Stratton walked in on patrol. His body camera was running. He didn't approach the counter. He didn't ask the staff anything. He scanned the room like he was searching for a target, then walked straight to Mercer's table. Stratton told Mercer there had been a complaint about a suspicious person. He told Mercer he needed to see identification. Mercer didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make sudden movements. He kept his hands visible near the table and asked two questions that matter in any stop like this: whether he was being detained and what the lawful reason was for the demand. Stratton didn't answer cleanly. He repeated the request for ID and framed Mercer's questions as refusal. He tried to turn calm procedure into non-cooperation. That was the first move in the power game, labeling basic rights as attitude. Mercer stayed steady. He kept his tone level. He asked again if he was being detained and what crime was being investigated. He didn't give Stratton anything emotional to use. Stratton shifted his explanation. First, it was a suspicious person complaint. Then it became a safety concern. Then it became a general claim about needing to confirm identity for the area. None of it came with a clear, specific reason tied to Mercer's actions in that cafe. Mercer didn't argue the officer's feelings. He just kept it procedural. He asked for the lawful basis. He asked if he was free to leave. He asked if Stratton was ordering him to do something under detention. Stratton started leaning in closer. The space around the table got tight. Customers nearby stopped typing and started watching without making it obvious. That kind of silence spreads fast in a room like that. People act like they're still working, but they're tracking every movement. Stratton then tried a different tactic. He told Mercer to stand up and step outside. He implied things would be easier outside. That's another common move. Pull the person away from witnesses and cameras, away from a setting where the officer's behavior looks unreasonable. Mercer didn't move. He asked again if he was being detained and what lawful reason required him to stand up and leave the cafe. That's when the cafe manager stepped in. Her name was Tessa Rowe. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't scream. She walked over like someone handling a problem at work, because that's what it was to her. An officer disrupting a paying customer in her business. Tessa told Stratton the staff had not called the police. She said Mercer wasn't causing a disturbance. She made it clear Mercer was welcome there, and she pointed out that the cafe had security cameras. Stratton dismissed her. He didn't ask for details. He didn't say he would check with the counter. He acted like her input didn't matter because she wasn't wearing a badge. Mercer stayed calm and let Tessa do her job. He didn't speak over her. He didn't get pulled into a back and forth. Stratton doubled down. He repeated the ID demand and again described Mercer's calm questions as non-cooperation. He told him to stand and come outside. He used the tone that suggests compliance is the only safe option. Mercer kept it strict. He didn't refuse everything. He refused the lack of lawful basis. He made it clear he would comply with lawful orders once the lawful reason was stated. Stratton's posture changed. He moved closer to Mercer's side instead of staying in front of him. That's not an accident. That's positioning. And then Stratton grabbed Mercer's wrist. It wasn't a full takedown. It wasn't a dramatic struggle. It was that specific moment where an officer transitions from conversation to control. The kind of grip that says, restraints are next, even if the officer hasn't said the word arrest. That moment got captured 3 ways. It was on Stratton's body camera. It was on Harbor and Stone's security footage from multiple angles. And it was on at least one customer's phone because someone near the back had quietly started recording when Stratton ignored the counter and walked straight to Mercer. Tessa immediately pushed back again. She repeated that Mercer was not a problem in her cafe and that the staff did not request police help. She kept the focus on the facts that mattered. Mercer was a customer and there was no trespass, no disturbance, and no staff complaint. Stratton didn't let go right away. He kept pressure on Mercer's arm like he was testing how far he could go before Mercer flinched or reacted. That's another tactic. Provoke an instinctive movement, then call it resistance. Mercer didn't give him that. He stayed seated. He kept his hands visible. He did not pull away. He didn't create a clip where anyone could pretend it was 2 sides. Instead, he kept his voice even and continued the same questions about detention and lawful basis. He kept everything boring and record-friendly. That was intentional. A few minutes later, the situation changed. Not because Stratton calmed down, but because a supervisor arrived. Sergeant Dana Whitaker came in with the look of someone who wanted the issue gone before it turned into a mess. She listened for a minute, watched the body language, then focused on the fastest solution, one that would make the cafe quiet again. Sergeant Dana Whitaker walked in and read the room fast. She saw Stratton standing too close to a seated customer. She saw a manager hovering nearby with that controlled panic businesses get when police start creating a scene. She saw customers watching without saying anything, and she knew this was the kind of situation that looked worse the longer it lasted. Whitaker's first move was the standard supervisor move: end it with the least friction. She asked what the issue was, then pushed toward an easy outcome. Mercer either showed identification or left, so everyone could move on and no one had to write much. Stratton fed her the version that made him sound reasonable. He said there had been a suspicious person complaint. He said Mercer was refusing to cooperate. He used broad language like safety and officer discretion. He kept the framing simple. Officer asks, citizen refuses, officer escalates. Whitaker took that framing and tried to convert it into compliance. She presented it like a choice Mercer was making, like he was deciding to be difficult over something small. Mercer didn't take the bait. He kept it procedural. He asked if he was being detained. He asked what lawful basis existed for the ID demand. He stayed focused on one thing. A vague complaint wasn't a crime, and a demand wasn't automatically lawful just because it came from a uniform. Whitaker tried to steer around the legal question. She pushed practical consequences instead. She signaled that the fastest way to avoid problems was to just do what Stratton wanted. She treated the lawful basis question like an unnecessary complication. That's when Tessa Rowe tightened the situation in a way Whitaker couldn't ignore. Tessa stated clearly that the staff had not called the police. She said Mercer was a customer. She said he wasn't causing a disturbance. And she said he was welcome to stay. That last part mattered because it cut off a common escape route officers use to justify removals. Trespass. If the property owner says someone is not trespassed, the officer can't pretend they were asked to leave by the business. Whitaker tested that anyway. She asked Tessa if she wanted Mercer removed or banned. Tessa said no. She confirmed it again. Mercer was allowed to be there? Now Whitaker had a problem. She had a patrol officer escalating inside a business that wasn't requesting help, with witnesses, with cameras, and with a man who wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening, and wasn't moving. Stratton reacted to the shift by leaning harder on control language. He described Mercer's questions as refusal. He implied risk. He pushed the idea that he needed Mercer standing up, outside, away from the table. Mercer didn't move. He didn't get loud. He didn't argue emotion. He held the same line. He would follow lawful orders once the lawful basis was stated. Until then, he wasn't going to perform obedience just to make the officer comfortable. Whitaker changed tactics. Instead of arguing the law, she tried to make the moment about convenience and public peace. She presented Mercer staying seated as a disruption, even though the only real disruption was Stratton hovering over him and grabbing his wrist earlier. She treated compliance like a social duty. Mercer kept it narrow. Detained or not detained. Lawful basis or no lawful basis. Free to leave or not. That's when Whitaker started thinking like a supervisor protecting the department, not like a supervisor backing her officer. She looked at Stratton's body cam. She looked at the customers. She looked at the manager. She recognized that if Stratton forced this, the footage would not match the report Stratton would later write. And she knew her name would be on the scene as a supervisor who let it happen. So she made the call. Whitaker ordered Stratton to disengage. Stratton didn't like it. His posture showed it. He wanted to finish what he started. He wanted Mercer to give in so the stop could be justified through submission. But a supervisor's order is a supervisor's order, and Whitaker was clearly choosing containment. Stratton backed off from Mercer's space. He stopped trying to pull him outside. He stepped away enough for the cafe to breathe again. Mercer didn't celebrate it. He didn't gloat. He treated it like a documented event that was still live. He asked for names and badge numbers. He asked in a way that made it clear he expected accuracy. He confirmed the body camera was recording. He did it calmly, but he did it in front of witnesses, so it couldn't be denied later. Then he made the most important move of the morning. He turned to Tessa and asked her, in front of both officers, to preserve the cafe's security footage from before Stratton entered until after he left. He specifically included the full window of time so no one could later claim the relevant portion was missing. And by saying it out loud in front of them, he made it obvious he understood how evidence disappears when nobody locks it down early. Tessa agreed immediately. She also mentioned the cameras again, making sure everyone understood there were multiple angles. Whitaker heard that and didn't argue. She just moved the situation toward the exit. She wanted Stratton gone before he said something worse or did something that couldn't be explained away. Stratton left with Whitaker. Mercer stayed seated for a moment after they walked out, not because he was shaken, but because he was mentally indexing what mattered: the timeline, the witnesses, the cameras, the body cam, the fact that staff never called, the fact there was no trespass, and the fact a supervisor had ordered disengagement. And while the cafe tried to return to normal, Mercer was already treating it like a case file. Mercer didn't treat what happened at Harbor and Stone like a bad morning. He treated it like a record that would get rewritten unless he locked it down first. He stayed in the cafe long enough to do two things while the details were still fresh. He wrote a clean timeline, and he made sure the evidence didn't disappear. He noted the basics in order: time he entered, what he ordered, where he sat, the moment Stratton walked in and skipped the counter, the first ID demand, the shifting reasons, the attempt to pull him outside, the wrist grab, the manager's statements about no police call and no trespass, the supervisor arrival, and the disengage order. He wrote it like someone who understood that later, small details would become the whole fight. Then he worked with Tessa like they were handling a safety incident for a business, not a drama for social media. Tessa had access to the cafe's camera system. She didn't just promise she would save it. She exported video from multiple angles, including the entry area where Stratton walked past the register without talking to staff, and the wide view that showed how close Stratton stood to Mercer's table. She pulled a time window that started before the officer entered and ended after he left, exactly like Mercer requested in front of them. They didn't keep only one copy. They created duplicates, stored them in separate places, and documented who handled what. Mercer made sure Tessa wrote down the export time, the camera angles included, and the system clock time. Those little details matter later when someone tries to claim footage was incomplete or altered. Next came the move that killed the usual excuse. Mercer sent formal preservation requests immediately, not vague complaints. Preservation notices that created a duty to retain specific records. He requested the body camera footage from Stratton and Whitaker, including the full pre-event buffer and the time after the disengagement. He requested dispatch and CAD notes tied to the call. He requested radio traffic. He requested the incident report and any supplemental reports. He also requested report version history and audit logs showing who accessed or edited it. This is what most people don't do, and it's why so many cases die. Departments can say footage overwrote. They can say systems purge automatically. They can say they don't have it anymore. A preservation request removes the ability to pretend it was an accident. Mercer didn't go online to argue. He didn't tag anyone. He didn't leak clips. He kept it quiet on purpose. A customer's phone video still made its way around locally because that's reality. But Mercer didn't chase the internet. He chased documentation. Within days, the department opened an internal review. On paper, it looked routine. Stratton wrote a report that tried to make the stop sound normal. His language was the kind that gets used when there's no real basis. He described suspicious behavior without naming what it was. He wrote about safety concerns without identifying a threat. He described Mercer as uncooperative because Mercer asked procedural questions and didn't volunteer ID. That report might have worked if video didn't exist. But video did exist. 3 angles plus a timeline, plus the manager confirming there was no call from staff and no trespass. Reviewers pulled the footage and started matching it line by line against the report. The first contradiction was simple. Stratton's report suggested he was responding to a complaint. Dispatch records didn't support that the way he framed it. The CAD entry didn't match the story he implied. The second contradiction was obvious. The report tried to make Mercer sound confrontational. The body cam and cafe footage showed a man seated, calm, hands visible, repeating the same procedural questions. Then came the detail that turned this from a questionable stop into a serious problem. About a week after the incident, a revised version of Stratton's report appeared in the system. It wasn't just an added paragraph labeled supplemental. The wording shifted. The justification got cleaner. The vague parts became more legal sounding. It looked like someone tried to retrofit probable cause language after realizing there was video and witnesses. And because Mercer had requested report versions and audit logs early, there was no way to pretend it didn't happen. The access logs showed when the report was opened and changed. The timestamps didn't match the original narrative timeline. The edits appeared after the preservation requests, and after it was clear the cafe footage existed. That's the moment the department stopped treating it like a customer complaint and started treating it like an evidence integrity issue. Internal affairs widened the scope, not because they suddenly cared about Mercer personally, but because report manipulation can infect everything. If one officer changes one report, you have to ask what else is being changed. They began pulling Stratton's prior stops in the same downtown zone. They looked for patterns, vague, suspicious language, Idaho demands, without a stated legal basis, repeated references to non-compliance when the footage showed calm behavior, and the same copy-paste phrasing across multiple reports. The pattern showed up fast. So did something worse. In multiple incidents, footage was incomplete in ways that didn't track naturally. Missing beginnings, missing audio, gaps that always seemed to start right before a tense interaction and end after it. That triggers a different kind of review. It's no longer only about whether an officer acted biased. It becomes about whether records were intentionally altered, withheld, or falsified. At that point, the case moved beyond local handling. Federal civil rights investigators got involved. The review expanded from one cafe stop to the unit's overall behavior downtown. They looked at who was being stopped, how often, what language officers used to justify it, and whether reports matched recordings. They interviewed witnesses from earlier stops, people who had never filed complaints because they assumed nothing would happen. They pulled the department's body cam retention policies, upload times, and access logs. They compared those logs to the times officers wrote or edited reports. They checked whether supervisors were reviewing footage before approving reports or signing off based only on the officer's narrative. Stratton was placed on administrative leave first, then suspended, then removed from patrol duties, then terminated. The department tried to isolate him as one bad actor because that's how institutions protect themselves. But the data didn't support a clean isolation story. The review showed repeated tolerance for vague stops and sloppy justification, and it showed supervision that prioritized speed over legality until the evidence forced their hand. That led to unit restrictions and policy changes, but the bigger fallout was legal. Federal prosecutors charged Stratton based on what the evidence supported: deprivation of rights under color of law, and evidence-related crimes tied to falsification and obstruction. This wasn't about a rude officer. It was about an officer using authority without lawful basis, then trying to rewrite the record to cover it. When the case reached court, Mercer's identity became known through official filings and declarations, not in the cafe, not as a flex, in the formal record, where credibility and precision mattered. And the reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Some people tried to claim the outcome happened only because Mercer was a judge, but the footage didn't care who he was. The logs didn't care who he was. The report edits didn't care who he was. The truth was simple. The same conduct that had been done to others finally collided with airtight documentation. That's why investigators also reviewed past arrests and stops tied to Stratton and officers close to him. Several cases got reopened because credibility was now damaged. A few prosecutions were dropped. Defense attorneys requested hearings. The city started paying for mistakes it had ignored. Stratton went to trial. The recordings were played. The report versions were shown. The audit logs were explained. Witnesses testified, including Tessa, who confirmed the staff never called, and Mercer was never trespassed. The jury didn't have to guess what happened. They saw it. Stratton was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The city settled civil claims and took public hits it couldn't spin away. Downtown business owners demanded changes because they didn't want police turning customer spaces into stop-and-frisk zones with lattes. The department implemented new rules that supervisors couldn't ignore. Bodycam footage had to be reviewed early in certain encounters, not only after complaints went public. Report editing was restricted and flagged automatically with mandatory explanations. Preservation triggers were updated so any formal notice locked records immediately. And stop documentation required clear, specific basis language, not vague suspicion words. Mercer didn't do a victory lap. He went back to being private. He kept the focus where he wanted it from the start: documentation, lawful standards, and accountability that didn't depend on someone getting loud or getting lucky. And here's the lesson that matters for everyone watching. In moments like this, the power game is usually designed to make you emotional, make you move, make you react, and then label your reaction as the reason for force. Mercer refused to provide that. He stayed calm, he stayed procedural. He made witnesses and cameras part of the record. And then he locked the evidence down before anyone could rewrite it. So let me ask you, if you were in that cafe, would you have recorded? Would you have spoken up like Tessa did? Or would you have stayed quiet and hoped it didn't turn into your problem? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced a stop where the story on paper didn't match what really happened, share what you're comfortable sharing. And if you want more stories where dignity, documentation, and accountability win in the real world, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel